cold winter air hangs thick over the black water as crates of East India Company tea splash into the sea. Lanterns flicker in the wind. Footsteps thud on wooden planks. In the distance, a bell rings, alarm or anger, no one can tell. What matters is this moment. The instant an empire's financial machinery begins to crack. Back in London, across the Atlantic, a treasury clerk writes the words that would echo for centuries. The pound must be defended. He does not know, no one does, that every reserve currency in history, from the Dutch guilder to the British pound, will eventually follow the same path. A 7-stage cycle. A rise built on trade, credit, and trust, and a fall accelerated by debt, war, inequality, and political overreach. What he also doesn't know is that centuries later, in the year 2025, another clerk in another financial capital will write almost the same words, this time about the US dollar. But tonight, we begin not with the end, but with the beginning of a pattern older than modern finance itself. Every reserve currency is born with the same promise: stability, prosperity, and global trust. And every one of them collapses with the same final symptom: that trust disappearing. This is the paradox at the heart of our story. The stronger a reserve currency becomes, the more its rise creates the very conditions that guarantee its fall. In this introduction, we will journey through 600 years of financial history, from the Dutch Golden Age to the British Empire, from the Spanish Silver Empire to the American century. And we will see how each world-dominant currency moved through the same 7 stages. As we begin, the question hangs like the scent of burning tea over Boston Harbor. If every reserve currency falls, what stage is the dollar in now? And how close are we to the next turning? To understand the mechanics of the cycle, we must first understand the architects behind it. Not individuals, but forces. Not politicians, but incentives. Not nations, but systems reshaped by their own success. Our first architect, the merchants of Amsterdam. They built the world's first modern stock exchange, its first central bank, and its first global financial instruments. Their guilder dominated international trade. Their ships connected continents. Their credit system financed empires. But financialization, the shift from producing goods to trading financial assets, became their undoing. The guilder did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it became too valuable to sustain. The second architect, the British Empire, whose naval dominance enabled global trade and financial supremacy. The pound sterling became the backbone of international commerce. London became the world's capital. But the empire's military and administrative reach stretched far beyond what its economy could support. Wars grew expensive. Debts grew heavier. The gold standard strained under political pressures. The pound didn't collapse overnight. It eroded decade by decade until the world turned to a new currency. Our third architect, the United States. The nation that rose from the Great Depression and emerged from World War II as the industrial and financial giant of the modern age. With the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, the dollar became the center of global finance. For nearly a century, it has held that position. But the pattern is familiar, and the cycle is repeating. As a narrator, I do not claim prophecy. This story is not about predicting the future. It is about understanding the cycle that has never failed in 600 years. And now, in 2025, one uncomfortable fact stands out. This is not an opinion. It is simply what the cycle shows. High debt, high money creation, high reliance on financialization, high social polarization, high geopolitical strain, declining trust. Every empire at stage 5 believed it would remain dominant forever. And every one of them was wrong. In the chapters to come, we will dive deep into how small nations become global superpowers, why foreign nations store wealth in another country's currency, how powerful nations shift from producing goods to manipulating credit, and why this is the most dangerous stage, how empires take on commitments they cannot afford, where the dollar stands today, and how money printing accelerates the cycle. The moment the world begins seeking alternatives. When the cycle ends and a new currency takes center stage. The year is 2025. Inflation lingers. Global powers realign. Central banks hold emergency meetings behind closed doors. And nations quietly accumulate gold, just as they did in the final decade of every reserve currency before this one. The pattern is not subtle. History is not whispering, it is shouting. And now, this documentary begins. Not with a prediction, not with fear, but with the same truth that guided merchants, kings, and empires across centuries. No reserve currency remains supreme forever. Every empire rises. Every empire declines. Every empire believes it is the exception. And everyone is wrong. Every empire begins as a small fire in a cold world. History's greatest currencies were not born powerful. They earned their status through innovation, discipline, and productive expansion. Picture Amsterdam in the early 1600s. Fog rolls across the harbor. Ships, their sails heavy with morning dew, lie crowded along the docks. Inside the warehouses, grains, spices, silks, and metals flow in like rivers. The Dutch are not the largest nation in Europe. They are not the strongest militarily. But they possess something more valuable. A system built on trust, record-keeping, and disciplined commerce. This is the first step of the cycle. Stage 1. Wealth creation. Nations rise when they produce more than they consume, innovate faster than rivals, attract global trade, maintain stable governance, build efficient systems. For the Dutch, it was the joint stock company, a revolutionary idea that let citizens buy shares in voyages across the world. For Britain, it was industrialization, factories powered by steam, coal, and iron. For the United States, it was mass manufacturing, electrification, and post-war reconstruction. In every case, productive growth created national wealth, which created military power, which created global influence. This is how a global currency begins. The world does not choose a reserve currency because it is told to. It chooses because it must. The second stage of the cycle begins when other nations start storing their wealth in the rising country's currency. This happens naturally, not by force. Why? Because global trade demands stability. Merchants in Venice needed a trustworthy currency. Nations in Asia trusted the Spanish silver dollar. Europe trusted the Dutch guilder. The world trusted the British pound. And today, global trade relies on the US dollar. When a currency becomes the preferred medium for trade, international contracts are priced in it. Commodities are denominated in it. Nations stockpile it as reserves. Global markets depend on it. This gives the issuing nation enormous advantages. First, it can borrow cheaply. Second, it can run deficits without immediate punishment. Third, it can exert political influence through finance alone. Fourth, it becomes the center of global capital flows. This is the golden era of an empire. Amsterdam in the 1600s. London in the 1800s. Washington in the 20th century. Each was the capital of global finance. Each believed the position would last forever. But the cycle continues, always. A nation that was once a world factory slowly becomes a world bank. This is the most important phase of the entire cycle, the moment the seeds of decline are planted. When a nation becomes wealthy, productive industries slow down. Credit-based industries speed up. The economy shifts from making things to manipulating things. This is financialization, and every reserve currency nation enters it. The Dutch created complex financial instruments, derivatives of derivatives. The British poured capital into foreign colonies instead of domestic factories. The American economy shifted from manufacturing to finance, consuming more than it produced. Financialization is not inherently bad. Banks fuel growth. Credit expands opportunities. Capital markets support innovation. But as the financial sector grows, risk grows with it. Leverage replaces hard work. Debt grows faster than income. Speculation grows faster than production. Asset bubbles grow faster than real value. The nation appears wealthier than it actually is. This sets the stage for overconfidence and overreach. The map grows. The treasury shrinks. every reserve currency becomes the backbone of a global system. Every reserve currency issuer becomes responsible for keeping that system stable. And every empire eventually expands beyond what its economy can support. This is the fourth stage: military expansion and geopolitical overreach. Consider the Dutch Empire, 1600s. They built the world's largest navy, but couldn't sustain wars with England and France. Their finances crumbled. The British Empire, 1800s, 1900s. Territories across 5 continents demanded military protection, administration, and logistics. Costs skyrocketed, especially during World War I and II. The United States, 1945 present. Globally deployed troops, hundreds of bases, and commitments spanning Europe, the Middle East, and Asia have created the largest military expenditure in human history. Military supremacy supports a reserve currency. Military overreach destroys the economy supporting it. The empire needs money. The treasury cannot afford it. The printing press answers the call. This stage is unmistakable. When an empire becomes trapped between rising costs and slowing productivity, its government faces 3 choices. Raise taxes, politically impossible. Cut spending, destabilizing. Print money, the easiest and the most dangerous. So every empire chooses option 3. Debasement. In history, Rome diluted its silver coins until they were almost worthless. Spain flooded Europe with New World silver, causing massive inflation. Britain abandoned the gold standard to finance wars. The U.S. closed the gold window in 1971, turning the dollar into a purely fiat currency. Debasement always begins small, always justified, always temporary, until it becomes permanent. Today, the dollar in stage 5 by historical metrics. Debt exceeds GDP. Wealth inequality accelerates. Asset bubbles outgrow productive capacity. Nations diversify out of the dollar. Inflation cycles become frequent. Money supply expands far faster than economic output. This is not collapse. It is the beginning of the irreversible shift from dominance to vulnerability. This is the moment when empires believe they are strongest, precisely when they are weakest. A currency dies slowly, then all at once. The world does not abandon a reserve currency because it is weak. The world abandons it because alternatives appear stronger. Stage 6 is the most dramatic phase of the cycle. Signs of confidence loss. Major trading partners settle in alternative currencies. Global central banks diversify reserves. Gold accumulation accelerates. Foreign investors demand higher interest rates. Political polarization grows. Allies question long-term commitments. Enemies test boundaries. This is not conjecture. This is the documented pattern of every reserve currency in decline. When confidence falters, capital flight increases. Bond markets weaken. Interest rates become harder to control. Inflation cycles become more violent. History shows that once a nation enters stage 6, recovery is extremely difficult. The Dutch never regained dominance. Britain tried for decades, but the pound never returned to global reserve status. Other nations followed the same trajectory. Is the beginning of the end. No currency collapses, it is replaced. When people hear the word collapse, they imagine sudden explosions, riots, or overnight chaos. But historically, collapse is gradual and orderly. What collapse actually looks like? The reserve currency becomes one of many. International trade shifts to multiple currencies. Global institutions reorganize. Bond markets shrink. The issuing nation loses geopolitical leverage. Inflation becomes entrenched. Wealth migrates to new centers. The Dutch guilder did not explode. It faded. The British pound did not vanish. It stepped aside. Replacement can take many forms. A new national currency, US dollar replacing British pound. A regional currency, euro. A commodity-backed system, gold, oil baskets. A digital reserve currency, CBDCs or multinational tokens. A multipolar system with no single dominant standard. The key pattern remains. When the world no longer trusts a currency to preserve value, the cycle ends. Empires rise through discipline and fall through indulgence. The seven-stage cycle is not a prophecy. It is a record, the most consistent pattern in global economic history. Why does it repeat? Because human nature repeats. Power creates confidence. Confidence creates overreach. Overreach creates debt. Debt creates weakness. Weakness creates collapse. Every empire believes it is the exception. Every empire is wrong. The forces that drive the cycle are stronger than policy, stronger than politics, stronger than any reform. They are systemic, structural, timeless. The cycle does not punish nations. It rebalances power. And when one empire declines, another rises. Stage 5 is not the end, but it is the point at which the end begins. Today, the world stands on the threshold. China increases non-dollar trade settlements. BRICS nations develop parallel financial systems. Europe debates strategic autonomy. Global South nations diversify reserves. Gold demand reaches century highs. U.S. political polarization deepens. Debt rises without limit. Interest payments exceed defense spending. These are not predictions. These are current realities. And they align precisely with the later stages of the cycle. Where it leads next, only history can answer. But history never answers gently. Voiceover fades in over a slow montage of changing currencies, collapsing empires, and shifting financial maps. It is here, now in this moment, that centuries of history quietly converge. Every empire believes it is the exception. Every reserve currency assumes it will be the first in history to escape the cycle. And yet, as we've traced the arc from Venice to Spain, from the Dutch guilder to the British pound, the pattern has never broken. The signs have never lied. The consequences have never failed to arrive. And when we step back and examine the past not as scattered events, but as a single, repeating structure, a shocking truth emerges. The fall never begins at the bottom. It begins at the peak, when a currency is trusted the most. That is the paradox at the heart of the reserve currency cycle. For the world's most powerful nations, the beginning of decline is almost indistinguishable from triumph. Their ships dominate oceans. Their markets attract global capital. Their militaries project authority. Their currencies become the backbone of global trade. And for a time, everything seems permanent, inevitable, unstoppable. But history has shown us that supremacy carries a hidden weight. A weight that grows quietly, slowly, invisibly, until the system bends under its own expectations. In Stage 1, the rise of a currency is built on innovation, discipline, productivity, and trust. By Stage 3, that same trust becomes leverage. Nations borrow more. They spend more. They promise more. By Stage 5, the system becomes so dependent on new debt that growth itself requires expansion of credit. And by Stage 6, the currency begins to fracture under inflation, militarization, political division, and loss of global confidence. Stage 7, that is when the world moves on. Not because it wants to, but because it must. This documentary has taken you through that entire architecture. Brick by brick. Decision by decision. Crisis by crisis. We've explored how Spain's silver fuel boom triggered the first global inflation, how the Dutch built the earliest capital markets, and then drowned under their own borrowing costs, how Britain's industrial dominance funded 2 world wars it couldn't afford, and how the U.S. dollar rose from the ruins of Bretton Woods, gaining the trust of a world desperate for stability. But trust is fragile, and stability is rented, never owned. The United States today stands exactly where Britain stood in 1920, at the peak of global influence, yet burdened by staggering debt. It stands where the Dutch stood in 1780, issuing currency faster than productivity can justify. It stands where Spain stood in the 1500s, carrying the costs of empire while other nations compete, rise, and innovate beneath the surface. Stage 5 is not collapse. It is climax. It is the moment the system works too well, too long, until it can no longer sustain its promises. It is the moment the world still believes, even as the foundation begins to crack. And today, the cracks are unmistakable. Countries diversifying away from the dollar. Central banks hoarding gold at the fastest pace since 1967. Rising interest costs consuming federal budgets. Geopolitical tensions pushing nations to build alternative payment systems. And inflation, persistent, structural, global, eating away at the credibility of every major institution. None of this guarantees the fall of the dollar, but all of it confirms the arrival of Stage 5. This is how every cycle has looked. This is how every cycle has behaved. This is how every cycle has transitioned into its final stages. The question now is not whether the system is changing. The question is, how long does Stage 5 last? History offers no exact timeline. Some currencies remained dominant for centuries. Others faded in decades. But all traveled the same route, from innovation to consumption, from power to overreach, from trust to strain, from strain to loss of confidence, and eventually from dominance to replacement. But here is the deeper, more unsettling truth. Reserve currencies don't collapse because they are weak. They collapse because the world outgrows them. The Spanish Empire collapsed when global trade outpaced its rigid institutions. The Dutch guilder collapsed when Britain industrialized. The British pound collapsed when America emerged as a military and economic titan. And the US dollar faces its pressure not from a single rival, but from a fragmented, multipolar world moving faster than any one system can control. The cycle does not punish nations. It evolves beyond them. As the outro comes to a close, imagine the camera pulling back, past stock exchanges, past servers moving digital money at the speed of light, past satellites monitoring global transactions. The world appears interconnected, complex, fragile. And yet, beneath all of it lies a simple truth. No reserve currency lasts forever. But every reserve currency believes it will. The United States is not doomed. It stands at a crossroads, faced by every superpower before it. Renewal is possible. Reinvention is possible. Reform is possible. But only if history is acknowledged, not ignored. Because history does not repeat itself. People do. The cycle is not destiny. The cycle is a warning. And the next chapter, how long Stage 5 lasts, whether Stage 6 begins slowly or suddenly, and what replaces the system that has dominated since 1944, will be written not by historians, but by the decisions made today. This is the 7-stage cycle. This is the story every empire thinks it can escape. And this is the moment when the world decides whether the pattern finally breaks or begins again. Fade out.